April 1, 1945. Easter Sunday off the coast of Okinawa. American naval officers witnessed something inconceivable unfold before their very eyes. A Japanese Zero, laden with 550 pounds of high explosives, slammed into HMS Indefatigable at a speed exceeding 300 miles per hour. The Kamikaze pilot had selected his moment with absolute precision. The British carrier teamed with aircraft poised for aerial deployment. Fuel lines were pressurized. Ordnance was armed. This represented the peak of vulnerability. American liaison officers braced themselves for disaster. They had already witnessed the grim consequences of kamikaze attacks on American carriers. USS Franklin had tragically lost 87 men from a single bombing raid merely 2 weeks prior. USS Bunker Hill would later succumb to 2 kamikaze strikes, claiming 396 sailors the following month. When a kamikaze devastated an American carrier, it typically necessitated 6 months in a repair yard at times. The ship would never re-enter combat. However, 37 minutes after the Zero detonated on Indefatigable's flight deck, the first sea firefighting aircraft landed safely, and the carrier resumed its operations. An American officer aboard the vessel observed damage control teams methodically clearing burning debris overboard and filling the resulting crater with concrete. He then turned to his British counterpart and uttered words that would echo through naval history. When a kamikaze hits a United States carrier, he stated, it's 6 months repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers, man your brooms. The Japanese had, by all accounts, perfected their kamikaze tactics, specifically targeting American carriers. They understood precisely where to aim. They comprehended the devastating impact of bombs penetrating wooden flight decks and detonating amidst parked aircraft saturated with fuel and ammunition. They had successfully sunk 3 American escort carriers and crippled 2 fleet carriers so severely that they never saw further action. The divine wind was proving effective. The casualties inflicted upon American personnel were stark evidence of this. Then, the British Pacific Fleet arrived, comprising 4 armored carriers, and everything the Japanese believed they knew about assaulting carriers was catastrophically invalidated. This is the narrative of how British engineering ingenuity forged carriers capable of withstanding attacks that no American vessel could endure. It recounts the tale of armored flight decks that transformed kamikaze attacks into what one American historian aptly termed scrambled eggs, and it is the story that American observers found almost unbelievable, even as they bore witness to it firsthand. The genesis of British superiority in carrier design originated not in the Pacific, but in the Mediterranean. Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson commanded HMS Furious and served as Rear Admiral, aircraft carriers, before assuming the role of Third Sea Lord in 1935. Henderson possessed an understanding that eluded his American counterparts at the time. British carriers would operate in confined waters. The Mediterranean, the North Sea, the English Channel, these were strategically vital sea lanes within easy range of enemy land-based bombers. British carriers could not afford to retreat. They could not vanish into the vast expanses of the Pacific. They would inevitably be located. They would be attacked. And, crucially, they needed to survive. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 served as a catalyst for Henderson's strategic thinking. British carriers conducted exercises in the Mediterranean, acutely aware of the threat posed by Italian air power. The vulnerability was profoundly alarming. In an era predating effective radar, when Royal Air Force doctrine rigidly maintained that the bomber will always get through, Henderson concluded that fighter escorts could not possibly intercept every incoming assault. Carriers required passive protection. They required armor. Henderson championed a revolutionary design that naval admirals initially deemed unfeasible. The concept was to construct an aircraft carrier where the flight deck itself was armored. 3 inches of hardened steel were to shield the entire flight deck. This armor plate would function as the ship's strength deck, the principal structural element bearing the hull's bending stresses. The hangar bay was to be enclosed by 4.5 inches of armored bulkheads, creating an armored citadel capable of surviving 500-pound bombs dropped from an altitude of 7,000 feet. Naval architect W.A. Forbes successfully resolved the complex engineering challenges. Several alternative designs had to be worked out, Forbes explained, before I could arrive at a fully armored carrier of 23,000 tons. And one of the principal secrets was that the 3-inch armor plate which formed the flight deck was utilized for both protection and longitudinal strength. It was an ingenious solution, unprecedented, and demonstrably effective. HMS Illustrious was laid down at Vickers Armstrong's Barrow Shipyard on April 27, 1937. The design process, which typically spanned 3 years, was compressed into a mere 3 months. Admiral Henderson tragically passed away in March 1939 from an illness attributed to overwork, just 2 months after resigning his commission due to declining health. He never had the opportunity to witness his groundbreaking carriers prove their mettle in combat. However, his legacy would ultimately safeguard thousands of British lives. By 1945, 4 British armoured carriers joined the Pacific War effort. HMS Formidable, Victorious, Indefatigable, and Indomitable constituted the core of the British Pacific Fleet, operating under American command as Task Force 57. Their primary objective was to neutralize Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Islands during the invasion of Okinawa, suppressing enemy aircraft before they could reach American forces. The Japanese pilots were unaware that these British carriers were fundamentally different. They had not been informed that 3-inch armored flight decks were impervious to penetration, unlike their American wooden counterparts. The Kamikazes attacked the British carriers with the same methods they employed against the Americans, and they discovered, to their grave misfortune, that everything had irrevocably changed. On Easter Sunday, 1945, at precisely 7:28 hours, the first kamikaze struck. 2 Seafire pilots managed to score cannon hits on the attacking Zero as it approached HMS Indefatigable. The aircraft began to break apart in mid-air but persisted with its assault. It executed a loop over the carrier and then plunged towards the flight deck, impacting on the starboard side, in close proximity to the island structure. Captain Quentin Dick Graham personally observed the impact. The resultant explosion claimed 14 lives. The flight deck itself sustained a depression of 3 inches over a 15-foot area. The pilot's briefing room was obliterated. The sick bay was utterly destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Pat Chambers, the flying officer, was killed. Lieutenant Leonard T.E., the air engineer officer, also perished. Dr. Alan Vaughan, a Canadian surgeon lieutenant, tragically died at his post. Yet, the armored deck held firm. The bomb detonated against 3 inches of hardened steel, rather than penetrating into the hangar bay, where 36 aircraft lay waiting, fully fueled. There was no catastrophic secondary explosion, no chain reaction of detonating bombs and torpedoes, no aviation fuel fires spreading across multiple decks. The damage, though severe, was contained. Lieutenant Commander Sandy Sanderson, the flight deck engineer, ingeniously jury-rigged a replacement crash barrier. Chief Petty Officer Jimmy Green valiantly managed a small hangar fire. Damage control teams efficiently cleared wreckage overboard and filled the impact crater with rapid-setting concrete. At 8:16 hours, a mere 48 minutes after the impact, the first Seafire fighter landed safely. HMS Indefatigable continued its combat operations throughout the remainder of the day. American observers were utterly astonished by what they were witnessing. USS Franklin, though hit by conventional bombs rather than kamikazes on March 19, had experienced a different fate. Those bombs had penetrated its wooden flight deck and entered the hangar, where 31 armed and fueled aircraft were present. The ensuing explosions and fires resulted in the deaths of 87 sailors. Franklin never operated aircraft again and remained under repair for 6 months. In stark contrast, HMS Indefatigable lost 14 men and was operational again in less than an hour. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. On May 4, 1945, at 11:31 hours, the kamikazes returned in considerable force. A Zero emerged from the clouds and struck HMS Formidable with a glancing blow, 9 feet starboard of the centerline, adjacent to the ship's island. Captain Philip Ruck Keene witnessed the kamikaze impact precisely at the junction of 3 14-ton armored plates. Fragments of the bomb penetrated through the hangar deck and into an oil tank situated below. The central boiler room was inundated with steam and had to be evacuated. The flight deck itself exhibited a 2-foot square hole and a depression measuring 24 by 20 feet, extending up to 2 feet in depth. However, the armor had not been fully breached. 11 aircraft positioned on the flight deck were destroyed. 8 men lost their lives, and 47 were wounded. The ship's speed was reduced to 18 knots as damage control parties grappled with the fires. By 1700 hours, 5.5 hours after the impact, the flight deck was once again operational. Damage control teams had meticulously filled the void with rapid-set concrete, timber infill, and tack-welded steel plates. Formidable resumed launching and recovering aircraft. Captain Ruck Keene later signaled Admiral Philip Van with a characteristic British understatement. "Little yellow bastard." Admiral Van dryly replied, "Are you addressing me?" Minutes after Formidable sustained its damage, 2 kamikazes targeted HMS Indomitable, Admiral Van's flagship. At 11:47 hours, a Zero ascended to 3,000 feet before commencing its dive from the starboard beam at a 60-degree angle. Intense anti-aircraft fire from Oerlikon's and Bofors guns set the aircraft ablaze. The pilot misjudged his altitude and made contact with the armored flight deck, skidded across the ship, and tumbled over the port side approximately 10 yards astern of the island. His bomb detonated harmlessly in the water. Burning aviation fuel temporarily engulfed the flight deck, but the kamikaze attack failed to penetrate the armor. Remarkably, there were 0 casualties aboard the ship. The flight deck was operational again within hours. An American liaison officer aboard Indomitable, having witnessed both kamikaze attacks, suggested the carrier return to base for repairs. Upon being informed that the ship would be operational shortly, he demonstratively threw his hat onto the bridge floor and stamped on it in utter disbelief. He exclaimed that American carriers with their wooden decks would have been completely incapacitated. 8 minutes later, at 11:55 hours, a second kamikaze targeted Indomitable, but was successfully shot down by the destroyer HMS Quality and the carrier's own gunners, crashing into the sea 10 yards off the bow. HMS Indomitable had endured 3 kamikaze assaults in less than 10 minutes, sustaining absolutely 0 casualties. On May 9, 1945, the Japanese launched coordinated kamikaze strikes. HMS Victorious was hit by 2 kamikazes within the span of a few minutes. At 16:56 hours, a Zero, executing a shallow dive, approached from the stern carrying a 500-pound bomb attached to a small white parachute. Captain Michael Maynard Denny ordered a 25-degree turn to starboard. The aircraft's wheels made contact with the flight deck. The undercarriage sheared off and the plane disintegrated, sliding 80 feet across the deck before crashing over the side. The impact created a 25-square-foot hole in the armor. The deck itself was depressed 3 inches over a 144-square-foot area. Aviation gasoline lines ignited, causing a fire. 6 minutes later, a second kamikaze struck with a glancing blow after destroying 4 Corsairs. A combined total of 4 men were killed and 19 wounded from both impacts, yet Victorious remained operational. The carrier resumed launching aircraft within 1 hour and landing them after 12 hours. Admiral Van bestowed upon the ship the nickname, Trojan, for its remarkable performance, having missed only 1 minor operation since joining the Eastern Fleet in July 1944. At 17:07 hours, a mere 11 minutes after the attacks on Victorious, a second kamikaze struck HMS Formidable aft. This was the carrier's second hit in 5 days. The impact caused the flight deck to depress 4.5 inches over a 10-foot square area. 6 Corsairs and 1 Avenger aircraft on deck were destroyed. 1 man was killed, and 8 were wounded. A red flag visual warning system, implemented following the May 4 attack, proved instrumental in saving lives, enabling the crew to seek cover when kamikazes were detected inbound. The flight deck was operational again in 48 minutes. The contrast with the experience of American carriers was stark and devastating. On May 11, 1945, USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes. The first kamikaze dropped a 550-pound bomb that penetrated the flight deck before crashing onto the deck itself. The second kamikaze struck near the island superstructure. Parked aircraft, laden with fuel and ammunition, on the flight deck ignited, triggering massive fires. 346 personnel were killed in action, 43 went missing, and 264 were wounded. The total number of fatalities reached 389. Despite the fires raging throughout the ship, Bunker Hill maintained a speed of 20 knots. The carrier steamed to Ulithi, then to Pearl Harbor, arriving at the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard for repairs. The vessel remained under repair when the war concluded in August 1945. Although fully repaired by September, Bunker Hill never operated aircraft again. USS Enterprise, the most decorated United States carrier, met its combat end on May 14, 1945. A Zero piloted by Lieutenant Shunsuke Tomiyasu utilized cloud cover to approach, executed a snap roll to invert its aircraft, and then dove through the forward flight deck. The resulting explosion sent the 15-ton forward elevator rocketing 400 feet into the air. 14 men were killed, and 68 were wounded. Enterprise withdrew from combat on May 16 and never returned to wartime service. The statistics paint a grim picture. British carriers struck by kamikazes suffered an average of 7 deaths and 25 wounded per impact, across 4 carriers and 6 separate incidents. The total British casualties amounted to 28 killed and 101 wounded. American carriers, with armed and fueled aircraft spotted on their decks, experienced 100 to over 400 deaths per major kamikaze strike. The rates of flight deck penetration differed dramatically. The 3-inch British armor prevented penetration in 5 out of 6 kamikaze hits. Conversely, American wooden flight decks were penetrated in 80 to 90% of kamikaze attacks, allowing bombs and burning aircraft to reach the hangars, where armed and fueled aircraft awaited. The comparison in repair times is equally striking. British carriers resumed flight operations between 30 minutes and 2 hours after sustaining kamikaze hits. American carriers required 2 to 6 months of shipyard repairs for significant damage. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official United States naval historian present at Okinawa, offered the most famous observation after witnessing kamikaze attacks on both British and American carriers. He noted, "A kamikaze hitting a steel flight deck crumpled up like a scrambled egg and did comparatively little damage." Morrison documented American officers observing aboard British carriers who found the contrasting outcomes of kamikaze strikes almost beyond belief. The United States Pacific Fleet report from May 1945 acknowledged this significant disparity. It stated that without armored decks, Task Force 57 would have been rendered inoperable, with all 4 carriers out of commission for at least 2 months. This official assessment corroborated the observations of those present. British armored carriers returned to combat 50 to 100 times faster than American carriers following comparable damage. The disparity in casualties per impact stemmed from 4 interconnected factors. Firstly, penetration allowed bombs to reach vital internal spaces. American wooden flight decks offered no resistance to kamikaze impact or bomb penetration. Kamikazes routinely breached the decks, reaching hangar bays where aviation fuel and ordnance were stored. British 3-inch armor typically detonated most bombs before they reached the hangar, confining damage above the armored box. Secondly, deck parks created catastrophic secondary explosions. American carriers frequently positioned 30 to 50 armed and fueled aircraft on their flight decks for rapid launch sequences, maximizing offensive capabilities. When kamikazes struck these deck parks, secondary explosions from detonating bombs, torpedoes, rockets, and ammunition triggered chain reactions, resulting in hundreds of fatalities. USS Franklin had 31 armed and fueled aircraft on deck when it was hit. The subsequent explosions claimed more sailors than the initial bomb impacts. British carriers operated smaller air groups, ranging from 36 to 54 aircraft, in contrast to the 80 to 110 of American carriers. They also brought struck aircraft below into the protected hangar bay between sorties, thereby reducing exposure. Thirdly, aviation fuel fires spread uncontrollably. American carriers carried significantly larger quantities of aviation gasoline. Their open hangar designs, featuring roll-up doors, facilitated the rapid spread of fires across multiple decks. The wooden flight deck structures were highly combustible. British enclosed armored hangars confined fires within the citadel. The Royal Navy had pioneered safety measures for its fuel systems, including storing aviation fuel in cylindrical tanks surrounded by seawater, purging fuel lines with carbon dioxide when not in use, and routinely draining fuel systems prior to anticipated combat operations. Fourthly, the timing of attacks amplified vulnerability. The most devastating damage to American carriers occurred when they were actively preparing to launch strikes, with decks laden with armed and fueled aircraft, ordnance being loaded, and fuel systems pressurized. Franklin was in the process of arming aircraft for launch, and Bunker Hill was preparing for operations. British operational tempo was generally lower, partly due to necessity with smaller air groups and partly due to doctrine emphasizing more conservative aircraft handling, thus reducing the frequency of moments of maximum vulnerability. Admiral Raymond Spruance clearly understood this crucial difference. On April 8, 1945, after USS Hancock sustained severe damage, Spruance specifically requested that British Task Force 57 strike the perilous Formosa airfields, rather than tasking American carriers. He believed that the armored British carriers would be less susceptible to kamikaze counterattacks than United States carriers. This operational decision by the commander of the United States Fifth Fleet demonstrated that American leadership recognized the superior resilience of British carriers and actively sought to leverage it. Actions, as they say, speak louder than words. The highest-ranking American admiral in the Pacific chose to dispatch British carriers on the most dangerous missions, confident in their ability to survive hits that would have crippled American vessels. The post-war United States Navy fully acknowledged the superiority of British carrier design in terms of survivability. A 1940 United States Naval Attaché report, following an examination of HMS Formidable, stated, "Were I crossing the Pacific, I would prefer her to a Yorktown on the basis that she might carry fewer aircraft, but she would be much more likely to get there." The official 1945 United States Navy assessment concluded that the damage experiences of several British carriers unequivocally demonstrated the effectiveness of such armor. The efficacy of armored flight decks against kamikaze assaults had been definitively proven. The USS Midway class represented the American response. These massive carriers, weighing 59,090 to 100,000 tons, featured 3.5-inch armored flight decks, augmented by additional armor plating at the hangar deck level. Unlike their British predecessors, the Midway class achieved both armor protection and significant aircraft capacity through sheer scale, being 2.6 times larger than the Illustrious, capable of embarking 137 aircraft despite the armor. All subsequent United States attack carriers incorporated armored flight decks. More significantly, the United States Navy adopted three revolutionary British innovations that paved the way for the modern jet carrier. The angled flight deck, conceptualized by Captain D.R.F. Campbell of the Royal Navy in 1951, allowed aircraft that missed the arresting wires to bolter around the deck without colliding with parked aircraft, thus enabling simultaneous launch and recovery operations. USS Antietam received the first experimental angled deck in 1952. USS Forrestal, commissioned in 1955, was the first carrier designed from its inception with an angled deck. The steam catapult, invented by Commander C.C. Mitchell of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, working for Brown Brothers and Company of Edinburgh between 1946 and 1950, utilized ship steam rather than hydraulic systems. HMS Perseus demonstrated this technology to the United States Navy between December 1951 and February 1952. In April 1952, the United States Navy opted to adopt the design and acquired the manufacturing rights. USS Hancock was equipped with the first operational steam catapult in 1954. This innovation proved to be absolutely critical. Without steam catapults, the United States Navy would have been unable to launch heavy jet bombers such as the A-3 Sky Warrior, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, thereby undermining the carrier-based nuclear deterrent strategy. The mirror landing system, invented by Commander Nicholas Goodhart of the Royal Navy, employed a stabilized mirror to guide pilots along the correct glide path, later modified to incorporate Fresnel lenses. In conjunction with the angled deck, this system enabled safe jet operations. United States naval sources acknowledged that the new carriers and the rebuilt Essex and Midway-class ships were viable in the face of modern land-based aircraft precisely because of two key innovations adopted from the British: the steam catapult and the angled deck. These three British innovations were instrumental in enabling the operation of successive generations of increasingly heavy and high-performance jet aircraft throughout the Cold War and beyond. However, the statistics, while illuminating, obscure a critical vulnerability that was only fully comprehended after the war concluded. Although British naval vessels equipped with robust hull plating demonstrated superior battlefield endurance, they sustained critical, unrepairable cumulative structural compromise that rendered them economically unviable for service following the conflict. The integrated armored hangar structure created a significant void within the ship's primary hull girder. Under the extreme pressures of near-miss explosions and the relentless cumulative stress from kamikaze impacts, the hull girder underwent irreversible deformation. This resulted in hulls progressively distorting and developing ripple-like damage patterns. HMS Illustrious, despite sustaining relatively minor combat-related harm, was decommissioned and broken up in 1956. HMS Formidable met the same fate in 1953, and HMS Indomitable in 1955. Only HMS Victorious underwent a comprehensive refit between 1950 and 1957, at an expenditure exceeding £20 million. The cost was so prohibitive that plans to refit the Implacable and Indefatigable classes were subsequently abandoned. In stark contrast, Essex-class carriers, even after enduring severe damage to their upper decks during combat, maintained structural integrity and continued active service for many decades. The USS Franklin, despite a tragic loss of 807 lives and suffering catastrophic damage, remained structurally sound and was kept in reserve until 1964. Similarly, the USS Bunker Hill retained its structural soundness and remained operational until 1966. This situation presents an ironic inversion of expectations. British carriers proved more adept at weathering direct combat impacts, yet ultimately could not withstand the ravages of peacetime. American carriers, while sustaining greater damage during engagement, remained functional and serviceable for an additional 20 to 30 years. The prevailing narrative of British carrier supremacy necessitates significant contextualization. The British Pacific Fleet encountered substantially lower enemy air activity compared to their American counterparts. During the Okinawa campaign, the United States Task Force 58, comprising 15 fast carriers, successfully neutralized 1,980 Japanese aircraft. Conversely, the British Task Force 57, with only 4 carriers, accounted for 75 Japanese aircraft. The Japanese launched 10 coordinated Kikyusui mass kamikaze attacks against American forces. None of these attacks were specifically directed at British carriers. This means the American forces faced approximately 25 times the level of aerial assault intensity as the British. British carriers sustained damage at a comparable or marginally higher rate relative to their numbers, with 4 out of 4 carriers hit versus more than 10 out of 15 American carriers. However, the sheer volume of attacks was considerably lower for the British. The British forces were never subjected to the sustained, overwhelming onslaught that American carriers endured. Admiral Spruant's directive for British carriers to conduct strikes against Formosa exemplified the American command's recognition and exploitation of British resilience, but it also underscored the limitations of British offensive capabilities. Task Force 57 was assigned the mission of neutralizing airfields on the Sakishima Islands, a supportive defensive role, while Task Force 58 executed the primary offensive operations against Okinawa and Japan. The smaller air groups embarked on British carriers resulted in diminished offensive power, typically ranging from 36 to 54 aircraft per vessel, compared to the 80 to 110 aircraft found on American carriers. Naval historian D.K. Brown concluded that a greater number of fighter aircraft would have provided superior protection compared to armor. The American strategy of preventing hits through extensive combat air patrols, rather than relying on armor to withstand hits, proved more effective in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. British armored carriers were conceived for warfare in confined maritime environments, scenarios anticipated by the Royal Navy, such as operations in the Mediterranean and North Seas, where they would be within the gun range of enemy cruisers and subjected to sustained land-based bomber attacks. This particular type of conflict never fully materialized. The actual Pacific theater favored American advantages in sheer numbers and offensive might over British emphasis on protection and resilience. Neither design was unequivocally superior. Effectiveness was determined by the operational context. British carriers demonstrated superior tactical resilience per hit received. Their armored decks effectively prevented penetration. Damage control teams could restore ships to operational status within hours. The number of casualties sustained per hit was dramatically lower. All 6 British armored carriers survived the war, yet British carriers possessed less strategic capability. Their limited air group size restricted offensive power and the effectiveness of defensive combat air patrols. The concealed structural flaw, stemming from cumulative shock damage, meant that ships that appeared to have survived combat were, in reality, beyond economical repair following the war. While American carriers, which endured worse topside damage, continued in service for many decades, the Americans faced 25 times more attacks but could absorb losses through their superior numbers, industrial capacity, and logistical support. American carriers, with armed aircraft on their decks, suffered devastating secondary explosions. However, this vulnerability was more a consequence of operational doctrine that prioritized rapid offensive strikes rather than a sole design deficiency. The most compelling evidence supporting British superiority does not originate from Japanese accounts, which are not readily accessible, but from American operational decisions that acknowledged British resilience and the subsequent adoption of British armored flight decks by all subsequent United States carriers. Admiral Spruant assigned the British carriers the most perilous missions because he was confident they could withstand hits that would have incapacitated American carriers. The United States Navy concluded that armored flight decks were indispensable for carrier survivability and subsequently incorporated them into the Midway class and all subsequent carrier designs. On Easter Sunday in 1945, American officers observed HMS Indefatigable sustain a kamikaze impact that would have crippled any American carrier. 37 minutes later, those same officers witnessed that same carrier launch aircraft. They observed HMS Formidable endure 2 kamikaze impacts within a 5-day period, returning to operational status within hours on both occasions. They saw HMS Victorious absorb 2 kamikaze attacks within 6 minutes and continue its combat operations. They watched HMS Indomitable withstand 3 kamikaze assaults within 10 minutes, sustaining 0 casualties. The American liaison officer, who, in his astonishment, threw his hat onto the bridge floor, perfectly encapsulated the collective astonishment of all who witnessed these events. British armored carriers possessed the capacity to endure punishment that no American carrier could withstand. The divine wind that had crippled the United States Navy met 3 inches of British steel and crumpled like scrambled eggs. When the war concluded, the United States Navy assimilated every lesson learned from the British carriers. This included armored flight decks, angled decks, and steam catapults. The innovations that enable every modern aircraft carrier to operate today are derived from British engineers who understood that in confined sea environments, survival holds greater importance than sheer size. Admiral Henderson passed away in 1939, never knowing that his armored carriers would ultimately save thousands of lives. However, on May 9, 1945, when HMS Formidable sustained its second kamikaze hit and was operational again within 48 minutes, when HMS Victorious absorbed 2 kamikaze attacks and continued fighting, when British sailors expeditiously cleared burning debris overboard and returned to action while American carriers burned for days, Henderson's foresight proved itself through fire and steel. The Japanese forces never comprehended why British carriers refused to be sunk. American observers could scarcely believe it, even as they witnessed it firsthand. Yet, the numerical data is irrefutable. 28 British casualties across 6 kamikaze hits. Carriers operational in under 2 hours. Ships that defied sinking, defied burning, and defied surrender. This is not propaganda, it is 3 inches of armored steel performing precisely as Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson designed it to do. To survive.